Bridget Eileen Rivera, thank you so much for joining us on A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bridget, before we get into who you are, your background, and this amazing book you wrote, are you drinking anything tonight?
I am. I have with me a Magner's Irish cider.
Oh, nice.
It's my favorite kind of cider. It's my go-to, I should say. I do have one that's like I actually like more than this, but this is my go-to. So
this is serendipitous because we are drinking an Irish whiskey. So
cheers.
Oh, no way. Great minds think alike.
Yes. So Bridget Eileen Rivera, the book is Heavy Burdens. I got to read the subtitle because I don't have it memorized. 7 Ways LGBTQ Christians Experience Harm in the Church. And both Kyle and I were rocked by this book. We absolutely loved it. Can you tell our listeners, Bridget, just a little bit about yourself and where this book came from?
Yeah, so, and I should mention at the outset, I have a cat and a puppy who is not quite a year old yet. And I did spend a good 20 minutes before this trying to get her zoomies out, but this is also her most active time of the day. And so you might hear like pitter patters as we are talking of like the puppy dog in the background running back and forth.
What's the puppy's name?
Sorry?
What's the puppy's name?
Farron with an F.
Nice. All right, good.
Yeah.
All right, Farron, we can take your noise.
nice.
Well, we'll hope so. And my cat hopefully will behave as well. Yeah, we'll hope for the best. But anyhow, to answer your question, so so I wrote this book, Heavy Burdens, 7 Ways LGBTQ Christians Experience Harm in the Church. And to, I guess, give a little bit of background about me, I do a lot of advocacy for just LGBTQ Christians in general, in the context of Christianity and in church spaces, Christian communities, and things like that. And I spend a lot of time talking about it, whether on my blog or on social media, and just kind of, I guess, challenging Christians to, I guess, really reassess a lot of assumptions that have been, I guess, the status quo for so long. So I spend a lot of my time doing that, and I'm currently getting my PhD in sociology. So I also spend a lot of time doing research to complete my PhD. And I also am an adjunct professor, which is, I guess, kind of part of the package when you're getting your PhD. Oh, there she goes. I'm sorry. And so I teach college classes as an adjunct professor as well in sociology.
Nice.
This book, you begin every chapter with a story from someone from the LGBTQ community. I don't know if you've known them or part of your community, or you know, part of your research, but this was one of those books that literally the first 2 pages of the introduction got me, because you begin with a story of you being in a small group and hearing from a mom telling about her son. Could you tell us about that story, that experience, and then why did you decide to anchor every chapter with a personal story? Where did that come from? And tell us about that.
Yeah, I guess for me, starting with a story was just essential, because the purpose of my book was not to talk about theology, not to talk about the finer points of doctrine. The purpose was to really get at the heart of what queer people experience in Christian communities, what it is actually like to be queer in the church. And I found that a lot of books will posture themselves as wanting to put the experiences of people first when it comes to LGBTQ issues, but it's more like a kind of, oh, and by the way, this is not just about theology, this is about people too. And it's kind of, stated, but then like the rest of the book is about theology, with maybe a few other quick reminders that this is about people. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted my book to actually be about people, about real life experiences, what actually goes on. And so every chapter is framed with a different story. And I did not include even a fraction of the stories that I could have shared. And I didn't even include the stories from every person that I interviewed for the book. I interviewed over 24 people, and I was only able to put half that number in the book, which just killed me because every story just was so important in so many ways. And I wish that all of those stories and more of the many people that I know that these things could be out there for people to wrestle with, because so many people don't really understand what it's like. And that's one of the things that I hope people also realize when they're reading my book, excuse me, is that like I share these stories that oftentimes can be very shocking, like the story that I open up with about the woman who says that she'd rather her child be dead than gay. And I share other stories of just incredible abuse, pastors, telling people to get out of their church and never come back. And I mean, the list just goes on. And these things can come across as really almost extreme to someone who has never heard of this happening before, has never spoken to a queer person before. And what I hope people realize as they're reading is that these stories that I share are not exceptional cases. These are not actually the extremes of what queer people experience. These stories are the norm. Like, I didn't actually have to search far and wide to find these stories. In order to find a story that does not involve some kind of abuse, I'd have to search far and wide for that. Yeah. I would say 99% of the queer people that I know in the church have some kind of heartbreaking story about their experience with other Christians, with Christian communities, with pastors, family members. And it happens so much. And often it's the same rationales being used over and over and over again. And it gets so tiring at a certain point. And so I wanted to bring that to the surface. I wanted to put that at the forefront because I found so many people don't know about this. And it was very frustrating for me to try to talk about this and often be told in response that I was exaggerating, that the things that I said that go on don't really happen. And it's like, no, this is happening now, today, real people. And yeah, I wanted that to finally be seen and reckoned with.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to a question I put in the end of the outline, but it would be good to ask it here. In a number of those stories, this common thread kept coming through that there came a point when this person who's a member of the LGBTQ community had to make a decision of what am I going to choose? My life, me being alive, or my faith? because if I choose my faith, I think I'm going to kill myself. And that's not an exaggeration. That reality is so nightmarish. I can barely get through asking this question.
Yeah.
But there are people right now who are facing that dilemma. Do I keep my faith, which if I don't, I'm going to be disowned by the rest of my family, or do I keep my life? Do I stay alive, not kill myself? Can you just, you heard these stories, you've, lived a lot of this. Can you just bring us into that reality, Bridget?
Yeah. There's several stories that were like that. A number of them end, with a happy ending. And there was at least one where the person was not able to hold on to their faith, and legitimately felt like they could not stay a Christian and live. Legitimately felt that way. And the thing about that place, when you're in a place where you feel as if you have to choose between living a livable life and being a Christian, that is such an impossible choice. Yeah, you hear them scurrying again. And people marvel at the high rates of suicide. And that's one of the things that I opened the book with, that religious involvement reduces the risk of suicide for every American demographic except LGBTQ people. For queer people, the more involved in their faith they get, the more likely they are to die by suicide. And people hear that statistic and they're like, how can that be true? Well, it's true because in so many churches, we have a Christianity set up where people are told that they have to pick between their faith and a life that is even just possible to live. And for someone who is a genuine Jesus follower, when you tell them that you either have to disown your faith in order to survive, in order to be able to make it through the day, or you have to live an absolutely miserable life that you will have no joy in it, no family, no love, but at least you'll be saved. That is a recipe for death. And that is the point that many feel that they are driven to, where they feel as if they have no choice. Their life is not worth living anymore. They can't go on, it feels like. And so what's the point of continuing to try? And so suicide feels like the best option. And because it's often felt that what's the point? I can't go on like this. I just want this life to end. And that's what a number of people told me as they were talking, that they couldn't go on. And yeah, it's so common. Even for queer people that have not attempted suicide, many have been brought to that point where they thought seriously about it.
So a second ago, you said the choice is between being a Christian and living a life that's possible to live. You didn't say, because I know some of our listeners might be thinking this, interpreting you this way, you didn't say between being a Christian and having an enjoyable sex life. And so can you flesh out, what do you mean by a life that's possible to live? Because it's so much more than just having a sex life that you
Yeah.
that's how a lot of conservative Christians think about it. What's so hard? You just don't do that.
Yeah, a lot of people frame it that way, right? Like, you are just choosing to forsake your faith so that you can have sex. And I have never spoken to a queer Christian who would describe their struggle in that way ever. Yes, the pressure around sex, around what to do about that, is huge. But there's even more so the weight of feeling isolated, of feeling alone, the weight of teaching that tells you that you are an abomination, that tells you that you are sinning just for feeling a certain way that you can't control. The weight of being alone and having nobody by your side, nobody to care for you when you're sick, nobody that you can call up at a moment's notice. The weight of walking through church and wondering who you're going to sit with that day. Our culture is it revolves so fiercely around sex and marriage that we have created within our culture almost a situation where it can feel as if you are barred from human intimacy if you forego getting married, having a sex life, and all of those things. And so it's not just about the sex, it's the whole package. And yes, sex is part of that, but there's more to it than just that, because so much we've wrapped up so much within sex, and we've wrapped up so much into the implications of having same-sex sexual attraction, to the point where it's not just about whether you have gay sex or not. There's also many churches that either implicitly or explicitly teach that same-sex attraction is inherently a sin, that you are sinning if you just feel this way. And it's such a heavy weight to have to walk around with, to the title of my book, Heavy Burdens. And a lot of people just can't do it.
Yeah. Or even not just if you feel that way, but if you identify with a community that describes itself in that way, which we'll get to later. Another thing we'll get to later, I think, is the irony that it's Christians, mostly conservative Christians, who are so obsessed with the sex aspect of this that their focus goes to, when, by your testimony, you've never met an LGBTQ person for whom that is the center of the story, or at least the whole story. So that should tell us something, right?
Yeah.
There's also, you didn't mention this in the book, but there's also the fact that our society is set up economically to be actively hostile to single people. And the church is doing nothing whatsoever to accommodate that situation. There's a recent Atlantic about this. Very interesting. So let's change gears completely. There was a chapter early in your book, one of the first chapters, where I did not see this coming. It kind of hit me out of nowhere, and I loved it. And I learned a bunch from it too. And it's an argument that ultimately what is responsible for this more permissive view of sex that's taken hold in Western culture, that most conservative Protestant Christians, conservative Catholic Christians too, might want to blame on secularism, or might just want to blame on LGBTQ people specifically. Your argument is that what's actually responsible for that happened in the 16th century. It was the Protestant Reformation. And some of our listeners are going like, wait a second, what? So I'm going to read a little quote from that chapter, and then I want you to give us kind of a Cliff Notes version of that story if you can. So you say, the reformers, and you're talking about people like Martin Luther here. Okay. The reformers introduced new assumptions to the Christian imagination: sex and sexuality as integral to human identity, celibacy as unnatural, marriage as a human right, pursuit of marriage for romantic love. It wasn't the 1960s that bequeathed such ideas to Western society, and it wasn't gay people either. It was the Reformation and the Christians who helmed it. So specifically, what I'm most interested in that quote is this idea that we should take a biological perspective on sex, or maybe we could call it a naturalistic perspective, where it's part of our nature. It's a necessary aspect of who we are, that we can't root out, that our religion doesn't change it, that it lies outside the bounds of the scripture, outside the bounds of any, religious authority or tradition, and that's how we should understand sexuality in this extra biblical, extra traditional way, and that is a Christian idea. Can you flesh that out for us?
Yeah, so this is a huge thing. I think what you're asking is super important, and it's one of the reasons why I start my book basically at this point with this question, because I think it's really impossible to understand a whole lot of things that exist currently today unless you go all the way back 500 years ago to the Reformation and the changes that happened at this time. And so I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that the Reformation brought the idea that the requirement of priestly celibacy is unbiblical. And honestly, I think that's the only thing that people really imagine that the Protestant Reformation changed with respect to sexuality. But actually, it's way bigger than just that, because in order to argue that requiring priestly celibacy was unbiblical, the reformers had to create a completely different way of thinking about human sexuality, had to develop completely different arguments and logics behind human sexuality than what had been previously understood from scripture. And so what you see in the reformers' writings, and Luther and Calvin are some of the most notable within this, is this idea, to what you were saying, that sexual urges are innate to human nature. They are intrinsic. You can't divorce our sexual desire from what it means to be human. And so to deny someone sexual intercourse, to deny them the ability to ever have sex, is to deny them something that is intrinsic to who they are. It's to deny them the ability to fully realize who they are as a human being made in the image of God. And I share this in my book, Martin Luther. He's making this argument, and he's bringing this out, and he says, like, sex is just as necessary as the fact that I am a man or a woman. It is innate to human existence, and just as necessary as waking or sleeping or eating or relieving yourself. Like, these things are basic facts. And so you can't deny someone sex. It would be like denying them food. It would be like denying them water. It's intrinsic, it's necessary. And so that was the argument that enabled the reformers to say that requiring priests to be celibate is unbiblical. Now, that doesn't seem super radical from our perspective, but it was world changing. it was a completely new way of thinking about sex, because before this, nobody had thought of sex as this thing that was intrinsic to human nature. And so it was at this point that you see the doors being blown wide open for new possibilities, not just that priests can get married, but that married couples who, for example, are sexually unsatisfied, maybe one of them is unable to satisfy, to meet their spouse's needs, opening the door for divorce, for those couples to get divorced, which Luther actually talks about. He uses that as one example, that divorce might be recommended for a couple like that. The doors open to remarriage, whereas previously, if someone got divorced, first, they shouldn't have. And even if they did, they are not allowed to get remarried. Well, now that's thrown out the door. Now we can get remarried if you're divorced. Why? Because like requiring that person to be celibate is unbiblical. It's not fair to them. And so like, there's this whole sea of change that happens. And this reimagining of what the purpose of marriage is. Before this time, marriage had been seen as a very, I guess, instrumental thing. It was sacramental and seen as instrumental to the, furthering of the human race, economic and things like that. But more and more, we're seeing a change during this time of like the reason why you get married is so that you can have sex and love. And so like you see this idea of romance starting to develop, and the whole way of thinking just changed overnight. And you can directly trace a lot of these ideas to the development of contraception and eventually abortion, because once you divorce the purpose of sex from procreation and start saying that the reason why we have sex is to fulfill our sexual desires, well, if the point is not procreation, it's to fulfill our sexual desires, then contraception makes a lot of sense. Because having babies is not actually the big reason anymore. And once you start opening the door to contraception, it's really not that far of a leap to be okay with abortion. And you can actually go into the 1970s, and major conservative Christian denominations supported abortion. The Southern Baptist Church, the Presbyterian Church of America, like you can read these major conservative denominations supporting abortion, and you can trace these changes directly to what took place in the Reformation. And yeah, that lays the groundwork for a lot of things that we see today, which I go into in my book.
So, Bridget, sticking with thoughts about the Bible, in chapter 8, double standards, which, man, you just slay so many things in that chapter. You write how for a vast majority of church history, and by vast, I mean almost all of it, contraceptive sex was seen as sin, pure and simple. In fact, Martin Luther, you said, I'm quoting from your book, Martin Luther said, any kind of sex outside of the purposes of procreation was sin, and that sin was worse than adultery or incest. Church fathers and reformers, I mean, I circled the names in your book: Augustine, Martin Luther, John Calvin. Church fathers and reformers held to this belief, and yet heterosexual Christians have no problem today from moving from this belief that has its roots in the scriptures, right? Like that's this amazing double standard that we have no idea actually exists and completely ignore. Can you bring us into that reality? Because it's kind of stark.
Yeah, wow. So this is a big one. And I personally think that this is the most fascinating thing out of like all the little historical tidbits that I talk about in the book. I am personally most fascinated by this. And So contraception. As you said, for most of church history, contraception was seen as a very bad sin, and even seen as being equivalent to murder. And that did not actually start changing until about 100 years ago. So we're talking about thousands upon thousands of years of church history. Contraception was never seen as okay. It was seen as an incredibly terrible sin. And only 100 years, the past 100 years, is it okay? So how did that happen? Well, I think important background information is understanding the definition of sodomy. Most people, when they hear sodomy, they think homosexuality. For me, in my context, I never actually, I thought that's what sodomy was. It was a man and a man having sex. That's what it was. That's what I thought the definition of sodomy had always been. And in fact, that's not the case. For most of church history, sodomy was not actually defined as being homosexual sex. Sodomy was defined as any kind of sex that subverted the purpose of procreation. And most of the examples were heterosexual, were a husband and wife using contraception to prevent having children, but to still be able to have sex regardless. And different ways of going about that, of making that possible, and different forms of sex were understood to be sodomy, such as, not actually having intercourse, but, having like something like mutual masturbation. All of these things were understood as being sodomy because they were done intentionally to subvert the purpose of procreation. That's really, really shocking to a lot of people, because when we hear sodomy, we think homosexuality, but that's not the case. And that really changes your understanding of verses that say sodomy is a sin, because, you'll have, and I'll see this all the time, I'll see, very straight-laced Christians, bringing out the King James Version and condemning sodomy and being like, the Bible condemns this, sodomists go to hell, and using that to point the finger at gay people, not realizing that verse is more than likely talking about them too. If they really want to apply it in a traditional sense, then when that verse condemns sodomy, that verse is condemning their behavior for having sex with their wife while using birth control, because they've got 3 kids already and can't afford a 4th one. And so, they're not having children. And
just in case any listeners think that this is extra biblical or something, this is rooted in the Old Testament, in the scriptures, right? When what's his name spilled his seed into the ground.
Onan.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite Bible stories, because there was a comedian named Dorothy Parker who had a pet parrot, and she named him Onan, and somebody asked her,
oh wow,
she said, he spilled his seed upon the ground.
Oh gosh,
I was gonna remember
I love that.
But it's really what I'm trying to say, right, Bridget?
Yeah. So, and again, I want to be clear when I'm saying this, I'm not trying to tell anyone that they are a bunch of sodomites for having contraceptive sex. That's like not the point of this conversation. And I even make that caveat in the book. Like, the point of this conversation is to kind of expose those double standards, which you said, of how we apply scripture. And so To your point, yes, for most of church history, up until 100 years ago, this was rooted in scripture, rooted in our understanding of what's known as the Sin of Onan, or Onan. I don't actually know how to actually pronounce it, but but the way the story goes is in ancient Israel, there was a law where where basically the brother of a deceased husband, if the husband had not provided children to the widow that was left, then the dead husband's brother was obligated to be with her and provide offspring to her.
Which, by the way, is polygamy. Just saying, endorsed by God in the Bible.
Polygamy.
Yeah, there's all sorts of interesting things in this story, but that was the law, and it was really designed to protect women at the time, because a widow left without any offspring in the society as it existed would be destitute. And so Onan was obligated to give Tamar a child, some kind of offspring, and he didn't want to do that. He had his reasons, they were selfish reasons, and instead he went in, he had sex with her, and he pulled out and spilled his seed on the ground instead. And so there's all sorts of terrible things going on here. And most people today will focus not on the sexual sin of him spilling the seed on the ground, but will focus on his selfishness. How could he do this to this destitute widow? How could he treat her this way, rob her of a right that she has legally? And yes, all of that is true and 100% accurate. Like, all of those things were terrible. But, and I think this is not often recognized, after Onan was sentenced to death and died, Onan's brother was obligated to give offspring to Tamar, and Onan's brother never gave her offspring, never even tried, and he wasn't killed for that, even though that was just as terrible and just as selfish. And he did not wind up getting sentenced to death for refusing to do that. So there was something particularly heinous about what Onan did that warranted him being sentenced to death. And what most theologians up until 100 years ago believed was that heinous act was spilling his seed on the ground, was subverting the procreative capacity of sexual intercourse, because they believed that Onan was, in effect, murdering a human being before that human being could even be conceived. And so that story formed the basis for the belief for most of Christian history that contraception is a heinous act equivalent to murder, worse than incest, worse than adultery, and which Martin Luther himself said, and was seen as sodomy, plain and simple.
Yeah.
And that shifted, 100 years ago. And what's interesting about that shift is you see that story with the Sin of Onan being reimagined now. to where people are like that. Back then, people will say like they didn't understand that male seed does not actually contain, the possibility of a human being. Like they didn't have the science back then. This wasn't, like there was misunderstandings. So there's all sorts of ways now of like reinterpreting this.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you see a gay person wanting to take a second look at similar passages that may or may not be talking about homosexuality, there's no room for interpretation. And so there's all of this room for redefining how sodomy applies to straight people, to the point where we define it away. Sodomy is not even any longer something straight people can do, because we've essentially defined that out of the possibility by making it just about homosexuality. But gay people, no.
Yeah.
They are the sodomites. They are the ones that are not allowed to look at the complexity of scripture. And they are the ones that have to have all the condemnations and all of the rules and all of the laws. Whereas we can stretch and we can make things work for us in all of these different ways, but there's no room on the other side for gay people.
And the appeals to church tradition, right? Because I hear this all the time, that what gives us the right? People for 2,000 years have thought homosexuality is sin. What gives us the right to reinterpret that church tradition? Which means that if you are married and have sex with your spouse for non-procreative reasons, you're doing exactly that. You're in the midst of an act which we've reinterpreted and said, church tradition be damned. I want to do this because it's right between me and God, right?
Yeah.
And my spouse.
And any pastor will understand. I mean, any pastor with a congregation that's going to stick around is going to, explain that away. They're going to massage the text in some way. They're going to say, well, we have to make allowances for cultural shift, and
but of
it's
course
not a problem.
But of course you can't do that for homosexuality.
No chance.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
So what happened 100 years ago to make that seemingly really stark break? Was it related to the insertion of the word homosexuality into the text? Did those two events have a common cause? How do we go from this is like the worst sin ever to nobody cares?
Well, it was and this is where understanding kind of the seismic shifts that happened in terms of the framework for thinking about sex is important. That happened 500 years ago, because those seismic changes had been building and building for centuries up to this point, until the rationales for saying that contraception is immoral and unethical no longer made sense. Like the arguments just didn't jive with everything else that people believed about sex, and what the purpose of sex was for, and what the purpose of marriage was for. And, you ask most people today what the purpose of marriage is. And, ask a typical Christian, and they'll say something along the lines of, to find someone that I can love and cherish, and within that have sex, and find intimacy with another human being. And that whole concept, finding intimacy, finding love, finding an outlet for your sexual desire, someone that you're attracted to, all of those ways of thinking just would be foreign to someone 500 years ago in the church. But now all of these things are intimately connected to what it means to be married. And if you are saying that in order to have sex, you also need to be willing to have children. Well, now you're standing in the way of people's sexual fulfillment, which is standing in the way of their human nature. And so like, there has to be this has to be allowed. And so, yeah, the rationale just didn't make sense for not allowing this. And so you saw the switch, you see the switch happening very, very rapidly, starting in the 1920s with the Anglican Church kind of caving on this, and then most Protestant denominations following thereafter. And I mean, it's not really surprising to me. And again, I'm not trying to make a moral point about what is biblical or what is not for people. I'm just wanting to highlight the stark inconsistency in so drastically changing the terms of sex and sexuality for straight people, but keeping such a straitjacket for someone who is attracted to the same sex. And I think it's one of those things where it's not surprising to me that we have actually in the past 50 years seen such a quick growth of affirmation of gay marriage over the past 50 years within many church denominations, because when Christians start peeling these layers back, start asking the hard questions, start looking at how straight people are taught to think about sex for themselves, and then start trying to be consistent and applying those same rules to everybody else, queer people included, the rationale for not affirming gay marriage kind of falls apart, because affirming gay marriage is a natural outworking of everything else that's come before in terms of how we think about sex, how we think about what the point is. And once you remove procreation from being the point, it opens the doors to basically what we see in our culture today, which is that all sex that you want to have is okay as long as you're not hurting anybody, as long as there's consent and nobody gets hurt. It's all on the table. And so that's what you see in the culture at large. And I think that is really an outworking of this idea that there is, like, the point of sex is to have sex. There's nothing else attached to it, which we see in Christian communities.
Yeah. And I mean, we're not going to go into this at length, but I just want to mention that this is done by heterosexual Christians in a number of ways recently within church history. I mean, by recently, I mean this last century, where, of course, if I want to have sex with my wife or my husband and not have to worry about having kids, sure, of course we're going to use contraception, even if it goes against the scriptures and against church tradition, because we've just learned more since then. Or if I want to marry someone who's been divorced, or if I've been divorced and I want to remarry, of course I'm going to do that, because we've learned since then and we've morphed since then, even though it goes against what the scriptures say and what church tradition says.
Yeah. Or if I want to charge interest on a loan, of course.
these are for heterosexual people. We break the rules. We go against church tradition, and we go against what we find in the scriptures. But far be it from any gay or lesbian person to even dream of that, or for any straight person to be affirming of sexuality. Never. That's the double standard that is just, it's undeniable.
And to like speak to what you're saying, like if I were a pastor, let's say, and I walked up to one of my congregants who was divorced, and this congregant was interested in like dating and getting remarried, and I told that congregant that their desire to get remarried was a sin, and that if they decided to get remarried, they would be living in continual adultery for the rest of their lives, unless they chose to divorce that person that they remarried and go back to their former spouse. And that they would just be living in perpetual sin. Like,
wouldn't happen.
That congregant would like be completely like not okay with any of that, and neither would the rest of the congregation. I'd be like, dude, you know what, stop meddling in my sex life. I am going to make choices for myself. I am going to decide what I feel like God is calling me to, and I'm going to do what's, best for me and the way I understand things. Like, no pastor is ever going to go up to someone in the church and tell them that they have to be celibate for the rest of their lives, and that the desire to not be celibate is inherently sinful. Like, no pastor would do that. No pastor would do that to a straight person, but pastors do that almost all the time to gay people.
Yep.
I think you're putting your finger on it there, Bridget. Like, the reason you don't see this with issues that straight people deal with is because if you tried as a pastor in almost any setting outside of a few super rural fundamentalist churches with like 15 people in them and they're all related, like, you're going to lose your church, right?
Yeah.
That's why you don't see it. But when you do it to gay people, you don't lose your church. Your church might even grow. And if it doesn't grow, it's going to feel more cohesive because now we have something to rally around and preach about and make everybody feel like there's a war they're a part of that's bigger than themselves.
And rather, if you allow it for gay people, you're going to lose your church to a church split, or they're going to fire you.
Huge benefits for denying it to them, huge costs for not denying it to them. And these are the same people who are preaching fidelity to the text every week and railing about, capitulation to culture. If you're right, and I think you are, this is the most two-faced capitulation to culture you can imagine.
Yeah. 100%.